All right, thank you, Sergi. So yeah, today I'm going to be talking about blockchain economics, which is joint work with Marcus Brunemeyer. So blockchains are an innovative new technology that have the potential to upend the way in which we keep records in a lot of applications. And this is pretty important because ledgers and record keeping are basically everywhere. So for example, there are lots of digital platforms where we want to share information. So for example, Amazon keeps track of all its vendors' ratings, or like the Nebula blockchain that we saw yesterday that keeps track of permissions given by users for some entities to use their data. In financial markets, record keeping shows up all the time as well. You need to keep records in collateral management for land registries, and also keep track of payments in the interbank market. And then the most ubiquitous use of blockchain technology to date has been cryptocurrency or digital currency. And this has really been pushed to the forefront recently with the recent rise and fall of Bitcoin and recent central bank proposals to issue digital currencies. So the question that we want to ask in this research is pretty simple. What we want to understand is when it's better to use a centralized record-keeping system and when it's better to keep records using a blockchain. And to this end, what we're going to do is we're going to build a model that's going to allow us to conceptualize and explore the trade-offs between centralized record keeping and blockchains. So the organizing framework in this paper is a blockchain trilemma. And what this is a conjecture that no ledger can simultaneously satisfy the following three properties. So first is correctness. What this means is that no agent has an incentive to maliciously distort the information in the ledger. Second is cost efficiency. So what we mean by this is that recording information in the ledger doesn't necessarily have to incur any sort of deadweight loss or resource cost. And we think this is important because in principle, recording information should not be an expensive activity. And then third is decentralization or competition. And what this means is that no agent or group of agents should have special privileges with regards to the ledger. And the reason we'd want this is because when certain agents have special privileges, then they acquire the ability to extract monopolistic rents from the users of the ledger, as actually we just saw in the previous talk. So in reality, we essentially always want our ledgers to satisfy the correctness property. So the ledgers that we see typically either fail on the cost efficiency front or on the decentralization front. At one extreme, we have centralized ledgers. So with a centralized ledger, you have some users who use the record-keeping system, and then you have an owner of the ledger. The owner of the ledger is responsible both for designing the rules and policies of the ledger and for recording information in that ledger. Now, typically, the owner of the ledger does not really pay a large cost in order to write in the ledger. The cost is typically negligible. But obviously, this is a centralized system. That owner has a lot of special privileges that other agents don't have and is therefore able to extract some rents. Now, at the other end of the spectrum, we have public proof-of-work blockchains. So with a proof-of-work blockchain, you still have these users who use the ledger and perhaps pay fees to those who are recording information in it. But then you have different types of agents controlling the ledger's policies and how information is recorded than you do in a centralized setting. So with a blockchain, you basically have agents that we'll call record keepers, who correspond to miners. And they are able to freely enter and record information on this ledger just by generating some hash power. And then you also have agents who we'll call proposers, who are in charge of essentially creating the rules and fee structures of the ledger. And these proposers are essentially like software developers who write up a white paper to propose a new blockchain or design a hard fork of an existing one. Now, the central question is, why do we think that this trilemma should emerge? And it really comes down to how you incentivize correctness. So traditionally, with centralized ledgers, this has been done with a dynamic incentive scheme that generates trust. So the owner of a centralized ledger, as I said, is typically able to extract some rents. And the reason for this is that, as I'll explain later, entry to write on the ledger is typically completely limited. There's only this one agent who's able to write on it, and this gives the owner of the ledger the ability to extract some rents from users. And also, if you want to create a competing system, it's not necessarily the case that you're going to be able to port over all the information that exists in this centralized ledger, which is going to create some switching costs for users who want to switch to a competing system. And this protects the owner of the ledger as well. So essentially, if users figure out that the owner of the existing ledger is engaging in some fraudulent activity, what they can do is just start using the ledger less, or they can completely abandon it. This will lower the owner of the ledger's future profits and create a disincentive for it to act fraudulently, which is effectively what gives you some sort of trust in this centralized agent. Now, with a blockchain, this dynamic incentive scheme is no longer feasible. And the reason for this is that record keepers can enter freely, so they don't have any rents. So if they misbehave, you need a static incentive scheme in order to incentivize them. You basically need to punish them immediately for doing something that's wrong. And the way we do this is effectively through proof of work. So when a record keeper reports some sort of fraudulent or incorrect information, like an extreme example would be, I enter a transaction in which I just create some coins out of thin air for myself. Basically, what has to happen is you need to pay a cost in order to create that fraudulent transaction, put it in a block in terms of proof of work cost. But in order to get some payoff from creating that block, other people have to verify your reports. If they think that you're doing something wrong, they can opt not to verify your reports and effectively roll the blockchain back to a state before that fraudulent block that you created. And now, this isn't also necessarily limited to a case in which you have outright fraud. So for example, in the case of the Ethereum hard fork, nothing was really fraudulent, but the community decided, we don't like what happened, we're going to roll the blockchain back. So what I want to highlight here is the two forms of competition that I mentioned. So first is the one that I think is more typically recognized as being very important that blockchains allow for, which is free entry of record keepers. And what this does is it creates competition among record keepers that prevents them from jacking up prices on the users of the system. Now, the more novel dimension of competition that we highlight here is the fact that blockchains necessarily allow for the portability of information to a competing ledger via a hard fork. So when you create a hard fork, basically you create a blockchain with new rules that contains all of the information in the old blockchain. And this can potentially be very important because with record-keeping systems, a big feature they have is that they typically contain some information that allows us to coordinate on some equilibrium outcome. So for example, think of a credit registry. If you have a lot of records of who's paid which loans, you know who are the good guys, who are the bad guys, and who you should lend to. Now, with a centralized system, when you create a new ledger, you can't necessarily carry over all that information. But with a blockchain, you can effectively have a proof that all of that information has been carried over, and you can continue to coordinate on it in the same way that you would have in the old system, while changing the rules that you might not like that the old system had. So basically what this replication of information is going to do is it's going to allow users of the system to coordinate on switching to a competing ledger because they no longer incur these switching costs. All right, so there are a lot of features of blockchains that are highlighted in the computer science literature. So for example, they tend to be more transparent than centralized ledgers. They're typically very efficient at achieving consensus. So you can achieve consensus in 1 minute instead of in 3 days, which is how it's typically done in financial markets. There's no single point of failure, et cetera, et cetera. Now, we think that some of these features are important and some are incidental. So what we want to do today is focus on 3 features that we think are really economically relevant in sort of describing the trade-offs in the blockchain trilemma. So the first is free entry of record keepers, as I described before. The second is this information portability property. And then the third is the rollback feature of blockchains that allows for the provision of static incentives for record keepers to follow the protocol. Okay, so now I'll just give an overview of the rest of the talk. So basically, what I'll do now is I'll show you the model and how the model generates the blockchain trilemma. And the way it's going to work is basically via backwards induction. So first I'll talk about how rents are generated in centralized systems and how blockchains eliminate those sources of rents. So rents are going to come from two places, as I said. First, they're going to come from the lack of information portability. And second, they're going to come from a lack of free entry of record keepers. So then I'll talk about how, once you understand that centralized systems will generate rents and blockchains really won't do so, how you implement the correctness property in each of the two cases. So I'll talk about the dynamic incentive scheme for a centralized ledger and the static one for a blockchain. And then if I have time, I'll talk about also the issue of ownership versus possession as it relates to blockchains, which is sort of orthogonal to trilemma, but we think is also an important distinction to make when talking about the economics of blockchains. Okay, so now I'll just give a brief overview of the model. So in our model, we're going to have two ledgers. There's going to be ledger A, which we'll think of as sort of an existing incumbent ledger, and there's going to be ledger B. And these can be, sort of any types of ledgers. They can be like a digital platform. They can be a platform for supply chain management, credit registry, et cetera, even like a social network if you want. And now there are going to be three types of agents in our model. So first type of agent is going to be called a proposer. These agents are in charge of creating the rules, policies, and setting the fees for each type of ledger. Okay, so in a centralized ledger, the proposer is just the owner of the ledger. And for a blockchain, the proposer, as I said, is like a software developer. And we're going to think about them setting the fees as both implicit and explicit fees. So explicit fees could be like Visa charges you to process payments on its ledger. And an implicit fee could be, for example, like I'm holding a currency. Nobody charges me for holding the currency, but the issuer of that currency inflates its value away. So then there are also going to be users. All users are going to do is they're going to decide whether they want to use ledger A or ledger B. And there's going to be a continuum of these guys. And then finally, they're going to be record keepers. So in the case of a centralized ledger, there's going to be just a single record keeper who's the owner of the ledger. And then in the case of a blockchain, you're going to have a continuum of record keepers who are going to be the miners. And in both cases, the record keepers will take some action to record information on the ledger. So in both cases, there will be opportunities for record keepers to distort the content of the ledger or attempt to steal. So in the case of a centralized ledger, basically just commit outright fraud. In the case of a blockchain, perhaps the record keeper could attempt to double spend or something like that if they have the ability to generate sufficient hash power. And then also in the case of the blockchain, record keepers will have to take an action to decide how much computational power they want to contribute in order to generate fees for themselves. All right, so time in this model is going to be discrete and infinite. And within each period, there are going to be three subperiods. In the first subperiod, proposers are going to set the fees for each ledger. In the second subperiod, users are going to decide which ledger they want to use. And then in the third, the record keepers are going to take actions to record information in the ledger. Now, the timing here is somewhat arbitrary. We set it up this way, just for ease of exposition. But at the end of the day, it's not super important who acts before whom. All right, so now I'll talk about the setup of the benchmark model within a single period, so how these three subperiods work. So as I said in the first subperiod, the proposers are going to decide on the fee. And they're going to care about two things. They're going to care about the fee that they're able to charge to users, as well as what proportion of users' phi use their ledger. All right? Just because, at the end of the day, for example, for a centralized ledger, the proposer is going to obtain fees proportional to also the number of users who are paying them those fees. Then record keepers are going to take two types of actions, as I mentioned. So for a blockchain, the record keepers are going to be able to decide how much hash power they want to generate in order to get rewards. So your expected rewards in terms of basically cryptocurrency fees that you earn as a miner are proportional to the aggregate fees generated by the system times the fraction of the aggregate hash power, Cj over C, that you contribute. And you're also going to pay a linear cost in order to generate that hash power. Then, in both cases, effectively, record keepers are going to be able to attack the ledger in order to receive some extra profits. So for a centralized system, basically, the owner can do that whenever they want. If they want to commit some sort of fraud, they can steal from you immediately, and then later on, if you detect this, you can decide whether or not you want to abandon that ledger. For a blockchain, in order to do so, you need to generate sufficient hash power to overwhelm the rest of the network. So the easiest example to think of is a double spend, although I suppose other types of attacks are possible, where you don't necessarily have to generate more than half of the hash power. OK, so then finally, we have users. All users are going to do is they're going to decide whether they want to use ledger A or ledger B. So this is sort of a very idealized assumption. In some cases, it doesn't really apply. So like think of currency. Like I can hold both Bitcoin and Bitcoin Cash simultaneously. I don't have to choose just one or the other. So we have extensions to address this issue. But in order to create the cleanest model possible to understand how coordination among users works, it's easier to think of them as just choosing one or the other. So I mean, perhaps just to conceptualize this, one thing to think of is I could choose, OK, do I sell my stuff on Amazon or do I sell my stuff on eBay in order to generate ratings for myself as a seller? OK, so the users will care about several things. So the things that I want to point out here are that they're going to care about, first of all, the stake that they have in the ledger. So the stake is going to correspond to the information that's pertinent to them. So for example, with like the Amazon example I just mentioned, it's going to be your rating as a seller. Or for a credit registry, it's your credit score. Or for example, for a ledger that keeps track of asset holdings, it's your holdings of each asset. All right, so basically, you like A if you have holdings on ledger A, and you like B if you have a stake in ledger B. All right, so second thing I want to point out is that users care about the fees charged by each ledger. Basically, they don't like paying high fees. So if ledger A charges a higher fee than ledger B, then that will tilt you towards liking ledger B better than ledger A. And then the final thing I want to point out is that we think it's important to consider network externalities in this sort of problem where users choose between different systems of record keeping. Because typically, if I use one system of record keeping and nobody else uses that system, it's basically useless to me. I like using a given ledger if there are others who use that ledger as well. So we have this network externality term that tells you that you like ledger A if lots of people use A, and you like ledger B if lots of people use B. And the strength of these network externalities is given by this parameter kappa. All right? And then we also, so last thing is we have this preference for cryptographic security that really matters only in the blockchain case. And I won't talk too much about that today in this talk. OK, so for the next part of the talk, now that I've outlined the model, I'm going to talk about how exactly the portability of information is important in generating competition among ledgers. So first I'll start with the case of competition between two centralized ledgers, where there really isn't portability of information from the incumbent ledger A to the entrant ledger B. So in this model, what's going to happen is you're going to have two proposers, the incumbent A and the entrant B, and they're going to propose some fees. And now users are going to choose ledger A or B given, number one, their stakes on each ledger. So they have some positive stakes in the incumbent's ledger because they've been using it for a while, but no stakes in the entrant ledger, and also the fee structure of each ledger. So basically what we show is that users' stakes in ledger A anchor them to that ledger, and that network externalities serve to amplify this anchor so that even users without huge stakes in A remain anchored to it because other users with big stakes in A really like to use A. So we show that when network externalities are strong enough, it's actually going to be the case that in equilibrium, it'll always be that either all users use ledger A or all users use ledger B because they really like to coordinate. And what we show is that A has a competitive advantage. Users will choose ledger A if and only if the fee charged by ledger A isn't too much higher than the fee charged by ledger B. And the difference between the two fees is proportional to the stakes that users have in ledger A. Okay, so that's this here. So now we can talk about how this differs from a case where you have competition between an existing blockchain and a fork of that blockchain. So here the proposer for the entrant blockchain is going to be, for example, a software developer who says, I don't like the policies of the existing one. So now the difference here, as I said, is that information is ported over to the new ledger. So whatever stake a user had in ledger A, they now have in ledger B as well. So, for instance, if I had a credit score of 750 on the existing one, now on the new one I have a 750 as well. So that's this here. You have stake in A here, but also on ledger B you have the same stake. Okay. So now, since there's no more anchor, it's still going to be the case that users are all going to choose the same ledger, but now ledger A can't charge higher fees than ledger B. All right. So users will choose ledger A if and only if they like it better than ledger B, just based on fees. Okay, so ledger A no longer has the competitive advantage that it had in the case where information was not portable. All right, and now, here we have sort of an extreme result that users will always all choose the same ledger. So forking seems like this really good thing because it always promotes competition while never causing some sort of harmful split of the community. So here we want to just emphasize this dimension of coordination, which is that information portability enhances the ability to switch to a new ledger. But in the paper, we also have an extension where we show that if users have heterogeneous preferences for each ledger, then you might actually have a hard fork where part of the community uses one ledger and part of the community uses the other, which is actually harmful for welfare. But I don't want to talk about that too much here, but it looks something more like what we see in reality with hard forks. All right. So now I want to just talk a little bit about how our results so far on information portability apply to currency competition and cryptocurrency. So as I said before, choosing ledger A or B doesn't really seem to be the right model for currency competition because I can hold both. So the way we think about currency competition is instead there's an existing currency A, and then users of that currency see that a new currency B is emerging and can choose whether to adopt it or not. Adopting the new currency is costly because, for example, you might have to pay an information collection cost in order to understand how this currency is transacted and not get ripped off when transacting that currency. So like a good example is if you want to exchange cryptocurrency, you sort of can't jump in because you might get your money stolen by an exchange or something like that. So the thing that we point out is that in traditional currency competition, basically you have to buy the new currency from some outside issuer. That means that in order to adopt the new currency, you really have to think that you're going to use it in transactions at some point. Because if not, you don't really have an incentive to pay this information collection cost. With fork competition, however, for example, like the competition between Bitcoin and Bitcoin Cash, you still may have an incentive to pay some cost to collect information about the new currency because of an endowment effect. If you held a unit of Bitcoin, you also hold a unit of Bitcoin Cash now. So even if you don't plan on using Bitcoin Cash in transactions, you still may want to collect some information about it in order not to get ripped off when selling your stake in Bitcoin Cash. So the point we want to make here is that because of this extra incentive to adopt the new currency, fork currency competition is going to be fiercer than traditional currency competition a la Hayek. All right, so now I've talked about the importance of information portability and how that enhances coordination among users. And now I want to talk about the importance of the openness of the right privilege that blockchains have, and how this enhances competition among record keepers and aids in the emergence of new ledgers. So in order to understand this point, we're going to have to consider basically a dynamic model, because we'll think about dynamic interactions between record keepers. So the dynamic model is just going to be the model I presented to you before, which is that you play this game with 3 subperiods in several periods over time. So t equals 0, 1, 2, etc. And the question we want to ask is, will a competing ledger with lower fees emerge in equilibrium? And the reason we might think that a new ledger can't emerge is basically that in a dynamic setting, if you're an incumbent and an entrant with a new ledger tries to enter and charge lower fees to users, what you can do then is undercut the entrant and destroy the entrant's franchise value, which may make it ex post suboptimal for the entrant to come into the market in the first place. All right, and this ability to punish the entrant is going to essentially protect the incumbent above and beyond the lack of information portability. And the result that we have is that basically this ability to punish record keepers who write on new ledgers from entering is a property only of record-keeping systems where entry is restricted. And the reason for this is actually pretty simple. When entry in record-keeping is restricted, then those who are able to enter have positive franchise values because their rents can't be competed away. Well, they can't be competed away completely, I should say. So essentially, if an entrant wants to write on a new ledger, what the incumbent can do is, as I said, just undercut them and drive their franchise value down. Alternatively, a way to think about this is that the incumbent could contract with the entrant and tell them, I'll pay you some fee if you agree not to enter the market. And now, the other thing I want to point out is that this argument applies to a case with a permission blockchain as well, where, for example, a group of the permissioned record keepers could decide to break off and create a new record-keeping system with lower fees. Then those who stayed with the original system could also decide to lower their fees and keep anyone from joining the newly emerged permissioned blockchain. Now, with a public blockchain, this ability to punish record keepers for writing on a new ledger is just not a concern at all. And the reason for this is that in a given blockchain, since there's free entry, there's no ability for record keepers to extract rents because all profits will be competed away. And what this means is that if a new hard fork, for example, is proposed and miners want to write on, record information in that hard fork, then there's no way for the miners in the existing blockchain to punish them for doing so, really, because those guys are not really going to have very large profits in the future. So there's no way to reduce their future profits. They'll just take whatever static profits can be had on the new ledger that emerged. So basically, free entry of record keepers also promotes perfect competition among ledgers in the sense that there's no downside to writing on a new ledger when there's free entry. All right, so now that I've talked about sort of how centralized ledgers generate rents and how blockchains do away with those rents, I'll talk about the implementation of correctness in both settings. So with a centralized ledger, basically, as I said, trust in the centralized authority is going to come from that authority's franchise value. And in order to illustrate this, we're going to illustrate a model with cheating, where we have the same game as before. We have these three subperiods on each day. But now, in the second subperiod, we're going to allow the monopolist that controls the centralized ledger to basically steal from users by choosing an action called an attack A that increases its profits in that period by A. There's no way, once the monopolist chooses to attack the ledger, for users to recover what they lost. So they immediately pay a cost that's going to be proportional to A. However, when the monopolist engages in this fraudulent activity, their action is discovered in the next period, on the next day, with some probability P of A that's increasing in basically the severity of the attack and the amount that the monopolist chooses to steal. So what we're going to do is assume that the users of the system for now are going to impose the harshest possible punishment on the monopolist. And what this means is whenever they detect an attack, they immediately abandon the ledger in favor of a competitor. And this is going to make the monopolist franchise value equal to 0 thereafter. So under this punishment scheme, we can talk about what the monopolist's problem is. And the monopolist just needs to figure out what's the optimal size of, what's the optimal amount to steal in each period. So, which is, what's the maximum A for this objective function. And basically, when they choose to steal, they steal some amount, then they see if they survive until the next day. If they do survive, they steal the same amount again, et cetera, et cetera. So this is dynamic punishment, as I said. It only takes effect after one period. So you can always steal something today, but tomorrow you might be punished. And now, once we have this problem set up, we can figure out, what's the first order condition that pins down how much the monopolist is actually going to attempt to steal. And that's given here. And it equates the benefits of an additional unit of stealing, which is just 1, with the cost, which is the franchise value, delta times V, times the marginal increase in the probability of failure, which is just P prime times A. And given this first order condition, we can figure out, actually, when it will be that the monopolist will choose not to attack at all. And the condition for this is essentially that the franchise value has to be high enough. And the reason is that when the monopolist franchise value is very high, then it's going to be very costly to steal even a little, because that's going to increase the monopolist's probability of failure by a little, and that, the cost of that is that they may lose their entire franchise value in the next period. So stealing even 1 unit might actually be very costly for the monopolist. And now what I should point out here is that we did all this analysis under the assumption that users impose the harshest possible punishment on the monopolist, which may not necessarily be the case. For example, Wells Fargo defrauded a bunch of its customers and yet still has clients. It didn't immediately suffer a massive run. So in general, you may have to give the monopolist a significantly higher franchise value under the assumption that the punishment scheme is not as harsh as the harshest possible one. OK, so now we'll talk about the case of a blockchain. So here we're going to have essentially the same model, except now, instead of a centralized record keeper choosing to distort the ledger in the last subperiod, what's going to happen is that there's going to be a large miner with the ability to generate a massive amount of hash power. And what this miner is going to do is decide whether or not they want to attempt a double spend attack by just overwhelming the rest of the network, and they have to pay a certain cost in order to do that. And then once they attempt a double spend, they can decide how much they want to double spend, which here corresponds again to basically the severity of the attack A. Right? So this double spend is detected in the next period with probability PB of A, where B stands for blockchain. And what we mean by the next period here is basically just some period before the attacker has managed to liquidate all the profits they made through their double spend. So typically when a fork occurs, there's a bit of confusion about what exactly happened. And PB basically corresponds to the probability that we figure out it was a big double spend sufficiently quickly. All right? So if the attack is discovered, if we figure out it's a double spend quickly before the attacker liquidates all its profits, a proposer will say, why don't we just roll back to a state before the attack occurred? So think about like the Ethereum hack, for example, was a similar situation. So users will then see this proposal to roll back, and record keepers will see it as well, and they have the potential to coordinate on going back, which will nullify the attacker's profits. Okay, so what we show in the paper is basically that when the attack is detected, it's always very easy for users and record keepers to coordinate on rolling back the blockchain. And the reason for this is that when they roll back the blockchain, they can actually recover what they've lost. So they have a big incentive to do so, even though it's not strictly within the blockchain protocol. And now, once we've figured out that the harshest punishment will always be imposed, we can ask, what exactly should the attacker do? What's their optimal strategy? And how do we incentivize the attacker not to attack the blockchain in the first place? So we get this optimality problem for the attacker. So basically, you pay L, which is the amount you need to overwhelm the network if you want to attack. And then what you get is your probability of survival times the profits that you get from the attack, which is L, the fees that even an honest miner would generate, plus A, the amount of the double spend. And again, we got a first order condition that equates the marginal benefit of an additional unit of stealing to the marginal cost, which is the marginal increase in the probability of failure times the profits that you get if you succeed. And what we find here is that, again, we get a bound that will tell us when the attacker has an incentive to remain completely honest. And what it says is that the static fee paid to honest miners in each period has to be sufficiently high. And the reason for this is that basically when you choose to somehow attack the blockchain, what you stand to lose if that attack is nullified is the initial amount that you put into attacking, which is basically the amount that you needed to overwhelm the rest of the network. And what I want to point out here is that what you need to make really big in order to prevent attacks is a flow cost. So basically, the flow cost of maintaining the blockchain needs to be high in order to disincentivize attacks. Whereas in the case of a centralized ledger, it was more like a stock cost. It was the owner's franchise value, so like a stream of profits. So in this sense, you might think, maintaining a blockchain is actually quite expensive because you need to pay big flow costs rather than just having a big future stream of profits. But a sense in which it's actually better for security is that we can always sort of guarantee that a harsher punishment will be imposed. And also in the fact that the probability of detecting fraud for blockchains may in practice actually be a lot higher than the probability of detecting fraud on sort of a secret centralized ledger. All right. So now if I have a little time, okay. I will talk about just the issue of possession versus enforcement, or versus ownership, because I think that this is sometimes a point of confusion with blockchains, although maybe not so much among this crowd. So the point we want to make here is that there are a lot of commentators who suggest that the blockchain might be the solution to all our problems because, for example, you can maintain land registries in third world countries where there aren't good records, but a lot of these analyses sort of ignore the distinction between ownership and possession. So what I mean by ownership is that, for example, there's somewhere a ledger that says that I own a certain piece of property. So, for example, the land registry says I own this piece of land. What I mean by possession is that the person who owns something is actually able to use it. So while I might own a piece of land in a land registry, there might be some guy sitting there squatting on my land, and I might not be able to get him off my land. And in order to enforce my possession rights, I typically need some sort of outside agent, which has almost always been a government. So for example, the US government guarantees that if I own an apartment, that there's not going to be anyone else living in that apartment. They'll kick that person out. So what we want to point out is that blockchain is very good to determine ownership, but that it's not so clear how blockchains can really determine possession, because you need some sort of enforcement that can't necessarily be conducted with a blockchain. And because of that, I think in a lot of cases need actually a centralized agent who coordinates with whatever's going on the blockchain. So, I mean, the point I want to make here is that when you have this centralized agent who coordinates with the blockchain, fork competition is no longer so great. And this is because whoever is enforcing the contracts on the blockchain can basically say, you know, if you create this fork of the blockchain that might be better for all users, but that I don't like, I'm not going to support it. I'm not going to enforce any contracts there. I'm only going to support contracts on the existing established blockchain. So centralization of enforcement power actually removes some of the benefits of the decentralization of record-keeping power. So just to conclude, to sum up, I just want to, you know, remind you that we start with the blockchain trilemma, which is, you know, correctness, cost efficiency, and decentralization. And that to understand this, we first figured out how fork competition eliminates rents. So why exactly decentralization is beneficial for competition. So we first talked about information portability, and then competition among record keepers. And then we talked a little bit about how the dynamic versus the static incentive schemes worked. And we saw that basically with a blockchain, you really need some sort of flow cost to maintain honesty, because any sort of dynamic scheme isn't going to work. All right, that's about it. Thank you. Yes.
A ledger. Country's history is a ledger.
Mm-hmm.
And then the way other countries, imagine you have a ledger of the old Soviet Union, you have alternative history, and then the effort to keep people off the ledgers. I mean, when you use the word ledger, we're all thinking finance.
Yeah.
But actually, it's a much broader perspective. Sometimes you have, in science, you have a group of people writing under one model, and another group of people writing under another model. We know in economics there'll be some journals will be more free market, whatever. So it's very broader. You can take this in other ways, I think.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. And so, you know, there have actually been, you know, proposals for blockchains that try to eliminate fake news by having people vote on, you know, what pictures are actually real or which reports are real. So yeah, no, it's definitely an extremely broad thing that people have thought about applying to, you know, way more situations than just finance.
Do we actually have, have you considered the coordination problem that people would face in order to break off? Yes, if I'm not happy with how a blockchain is, or how the community deals with it, or how all the rules are enforced or not. I could leave, yes, but I'm this infinitely small actor who has no power at all. What do you see as a coordination mechanism?
So here actually, so what we show when we're talking about information portability, that it's precisely a coordination mechanism that aids users in switching to a new system when information is portable. So it's not to say that they'll always perfectly coordinate. I mean, I think that's just not true. And in reality, when we see hard forks, obviously, a lot of the time, part of the community uses one branch and part of the community uses the other. But the point that we want to make is that the coordination mechanism is sort of that I, as a user, know that other users aren't facing super high switching costs. So this gives us an additional incentive to switch to this new ledger.
So you just think that the switching cost being low is
Right. So, I mean, so we use an equilibrium selection mechanism in the paper, and it's based on global games, which, you know, really formally, global games is based on like super high order beliefs, which I don't know if that's super reasonable empirically. But there's a simple way of thinking about global games, which is that, you know, in most models with this equilibrium refinement, It's essentially equivalent to just having users who don't, or agents who don't know much about how others are going to act. So they sort of think that an agent who is fundamentally indifferent between the two ledgers will act randomly. So if you have users who don't really know how others are going to act, this increases the probability of coordinating when these switching costs are low, because more agents prefer the new ledger to the old one.